Welcome. Today we're going to take a look at character-driven stories. There are actually two different ways to design a story. You can have a character-driven story or a plot-driven story. And for today, we're going to focus in on the character-driven stories. So what is a character-driven story? So you might guess by the title that this is a story which can be a short story or a novel or a play. It can be any type of narrative that's all about the character. The character is what drives that story forward. The story is focused on the character and especially on the character's experiences. So in a character-driven story, your character is that main focus, and as well as the character's thoughts, feelings, changes that they make as a character as they're going through the story, as well as their interactions with the other characters as the plot unfolds. So it's all about the people. So why would you write a character-driven story? So since there are two ways to design a story, a character-driven story or a plot-driven story, this is a pretty major way to create a story that your reader is going to connect with. In the character-driven story, the reader is engaged with the character. So the reader is reading to learn about the character, to know what happens to the character, and actually becomes invested, especially emotionally, in that character. In these character-driven stories, your readers tend to have an emotional connection to the character and they care about the character. So if you've ever read a story where you really cared about the character, you didn't necessarily have to like them, but if you cared about them, you cared about what was happening, what was going to happen next to them, and so forth, that may have been a character-driven story. So in a character-driven story, you're going to find that the people are the focus. Now, of course, I recognize that in stories, other things besides humans can be characters. Of course, you can have aliens, you can have animals, you can have other kinds of things. But for the sake of simple explanation, in a character-driven story, the people within that story, they're going to be the focus. You're also going to have a focus on thoughts, emotions, and the internal storytelling. So telling what is happening internally for the characters, that's going to become really important. And typically, you're also going to have an internal struggle or a subplot about internal struggle that is within that story. So it's not just about what's happening on the outside world, but it's also happening inside of the character. That's going to be important. So the attributes of a character-driven story. If you're looking at a story and you're wondering, is this a character-driven story or is this a plot-driven story? So the characters are active participants in the story. This is important. Things don't just happen to them, but they are active participants, so they are doing things. Readers tend to feel like they understand the protagonist and they understand the antagonist pretty well, even if they disagree with them. I don't think that you necessarily have to identify with a character or like the character to be able to understand them. So you might look at a story and you might say, well, I don't really see myself in these characters, but I understand what they're doing. I understand what motivates them. They at least make logical sense to me. Those are the attributes of a character-driven story. And if we were to take a look at a couple of examples, I've got a couple of examples of well-known books here. So we've got Pride and Prejudice. This is a very well-known book by Jane Austen. This really is about the story of the main character, Elizabeth Bennet. Now, she has 4 other sisters who are all included in the book. She's got her parents who are included in the book. She's got friends who are included, and, of course, the love interest and so forth. But this story is really about Elizabeth Bennet. It's about her and how she changes throughout the story, as well as the things that she does and the things that are done to her, both directions. Catcher in the Rye, this is another excellent example, read by many people in junior high and high school, J.D. Salinger. This is the story of Holden Caulfield. So Holden takes part in a lot of activities, and activities happen to him too. A lot of consequences to his actions occur when you're talking about Holden Caulfield. That whole story, it's about him, and it's about the choices that he makes and how he as a character drives that story forward. Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. Another example with the main character, Holly Golightly. Again, this story is a character-driven story. It's about the character Holly. It's about how she changes as a person. It's about the activities that she's involved in. It's about how she drives that story forward. And then finally, we also have The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. And we have the character Jingmei Wu, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who also goes by June. She's the main character in this, and we get a lot of internal information, a lot of internal storytelling about Jingmei and what happens to her, and how she's involved in her own internal narrative. Now, as you're reading stories and you're wondering, is this a character-driven story or is this a plot-driven story? As a reader, if you're really impacted by the character more than the plot, then it's likely that that story is probably a character-driven story. So as you're doing your writing, you want to think about the perspective of the reader, and then you also want to think about the perspective of the writer. So to create a character-driven story, you really want to have a good focus on your protagonist. Typically, the protagonist is the character who is driving that story forward. You want to give that protagonist a problem that they need to overcome. Maybe they need to change as a person, adjust their attitude, change their viewpoint, something to that effect. So you're going to have some sort of change that's going to occur with your character. You can't have a flat character in a character-driven story. You need to have a dynamic character. You want to make sure that your character has a past, a present, and a future. So give them a backstory and give them something they're looking forward to. And give your protagonist some relatable characteristics. Again, your reader doesn't have to love your protagonist. Your reader doesn't necessarily have to identify with your protagonist, but they should be able to understand them. You should be able to find that character to be relatable and allow your character to be human. You want your character to have human qualities, to make human errors, to do things that other people would do. That's typically something that we look for in a good character-driven story. So, character-driven story is one of the two ways of designing a story, and hopefully this information will be helpful to you as you write your next story.